Yeesh. Lights on, seems to work. Okay, so we're going to start today with Japan in the Tokugawa era. Take it from about 1500, when we're supposed to be walking into the world, and take it all the way up until the 1800s. Which is difficult because, again, like a lot of other topics we're going to discuss in this class, it's almost impossible to do that much history in an hour. We're going to stick to the highlights. Like when we get to the Cold War, we're going to try to do the whole Cold War in an hour. It's just not going to work. It's too complex. So we're going to stick to the highlights and try to get through it, understanding the big events and the big ideas. And one of the big ideas is that's where Japan is. You guys took the map quiz already, right? Okay, so you should know that's where Japan is. And I always put these maps up first off because I, again, spent this day in a high school with very clear evidence that these students don't know anything at all. But, so that's where Japan is. Japan had a long history of different empires, dynasties, much like China in a lot of ways. The central administration of Japan had become known as the shogunate through previous centuries going up to about the year 1500. That government is having big problems as we walk into the year 1500, and it finally just collapses into a style of civil war, where the feudal lords, the big landowners basically, can raise samurai-type armies and start attacking each other. Much like in Europe, you attack your neighbor to get his land and property, make it part of your own, therefore you increase your wealth and power. So Japan is experiencing a certain amount of political, social, civil chaos as we walk into the beginning of this course. Much of this is ended in the late 1500s when one landowner and kind of high-ranking general of his area named Nobunaga becomes dominant over many of the other landlords or landowners. He appears to reign supreme over a whole lot of them, not all of Japan, but a whole lot of it, beginning in 1568 when he conquers Kyoto, one of the ancient Japanese cities that was often associated with the imperial capital from previous governments. So that's a symbolic event. That is like in case of the U.S. Civil War, the enemy conquers Washington, D.C. That makes it really look like, the war is going to end soon. The civil wars do not end, but Nobunaga extends his control to the point where he is basically ruling over large parts of Japan. Not the whole thing, but he is bringing a certain amount of unity and control and leadership that Japan had not experienced for several decades by that point. One of the ways he extended his control was to basically eradicate anyone who complained about what he was doing. He is very heavy-handed, cutthroat type of politician. Anyone who complained was jailed, sometimes executed. One group that complained pretty clearly against what he was doing were Buddhists in Japan, often nonviolent people who complain about the brutality of this rising government, and they are therefore rigidly suppressed by Nobunaga's leadership. And they are very much victimized throughout the rest of his life. I don't know if I have another slide of... Yep, okay. All right, so Nobunaga does not die of natural causes. Why? Because he's angered a lot of people and caused a lot of kind of fear of government. So eventually, an assassination takes him out. It appears that one of his higher-ranking generals murders him, and that throws the government back into a certain level of instability for a few years until the next guy rises. So it takes about 8 years until the next leading general is able to consolidate power under his own position and he will unify Japan. And when we use the word unify under these kinds of dictatorships, it's usually conquest. It's not just writing a letter out to the people or giving a speech and saying, who wants to all be unified under my leadership? A lot of them fight back to the bitter end. So they're not unified until they're actually conquered and repressed. But Hideyoshi accomplishes this by about 1590, and he leads the next kind of era of centralized government. He'll be around for about 10 years until he does die, apparently, of natural causes. The way that he extended control was to conquer large lands out in the countryside, large chunks of Japan, take the land from the people who resisted him, then parcel up and give it out to his political supporters. So this looks a lot like European feudalism. He makes his friends in government, the people who have supported his move to power, gives them land, and land is wealth in these ancient types of societies. So they become the big landowners. In Japanese terminology, they become known as the daimyo, the big feudal landowners who will make so much money off their land that they can raise militias, they can buy private armies. They are the big, rich class in Japan. And he gets them on his side by giving them the land in the first place. So they largely support him. Another group that Hideyoshi understood he would have to dominate one way or another were the samurai, which are basically the warrior class, the traditional warrior class of Japan. Under Hideyoshi, you start to see a gradual movement toward taking land away from the samurai and really just making them kind of wage workers or hired militant fighters for the daimyo. So a lot of the samurai are disenfranchised economically. Their wealth is taken, or their access to wealth, their land is taken and given out to others, and they are forced to basically go be like knights in Europe, where they went to work for some other landowner in order to, make enough money or get a residence or a room in the landowner's house or the castle or whatever. And that was better than nothing, so they decided to eventually follow Hideyoshi. And this starts off a long, gradual process of economically attacking the samurai that's going to last hundreds of years, that will eventually make the samurai into a rebellious class, a revolutionary class against the government, but not especially yet. Another thing that Hideyoshi does is unify Japan. He starts obviously conquering the largest cities, and he brings a national currency. One of the major problems for Japan up to that point was that they were using different kinds of money in different parts of the country. So he does away with that by building a national currency and really starts tying the different regions of Japan, the different cities, together economically through trade. So you're also going to start seeing the rise of a new merchant class. People who are not landowners, they don't make money off of renting their land or growing food and selling at market. They buy and sell things from one region of Japan to another, and eventually start trying to travel to other parts of East Asia to get rare goods from other civilizations and bring it back to Japan. So they are the kind of rising merchant class that we also saw in Europe in the 15 and 1600s. So Japan, politically, is undergoing a lot of very similar things to Europe at the same time. The reemergence of a kind of feudalism, and eventually the rise of a new source of wealth that will do battle with the landowners for power. So all that makes sense so far. Questions about any of this? No. Okay. Hideyoshi accomplishes something that very few other Japanese leaders had accomplished for a whole lot of Japanese history. He not only conquers the mainland islands of Japan, the real big islands, he also conquers the further southwest ones, Shikoku and Kyushu. And he even attempts to send ships to conquer the Korean peninsula, which is just across the sea. And that is something that the Japanese have tried over and over again, and the Chinese have tried over and over again. So the Korean civilization is often pushed and pulled between these two powerful kind of imperial governments throughout Korean history. Every once in a while, the Chinese go and invade and colonize Korea and try to conquer it and hold it for a long time. When the Chinese dynasty falls apart, they largely withdraw. And then the Japanese come in and try to do the same kind of colonization. It goes back and forth for centuries, many centuries, for thousands of years. So this is nothing new. Hideyoshi tries it again. The last one to take up this amount of centralized leadership after Hideyoshi is named Tokugawa Era. He becomes so powerful, unifies the shogunate, that eventually this style of government takes his name. So he will be around for quite a while, not just a decade, like the other leaders had been so far. His power, he was one of the bigger daimyo from one particular region, one city called Edo. So he controlled that. That eventually becomes known as Tokyo, so one of the larger population centers. And he, after Hideyoshi leaves the scene in 1598, there is a certain amount of infighting to determine who the next big leader of this new shogunate is going to be. And eventually, Tokugawa wins out. So he comes from Edo. He first goes after Kyoto and then Osaka and starts, knocking out the big cities one after another through conquest, and eventually has enough control to not just proclaim himself leader, but actually uses the term shogun, which is a kind of traditional term for, it's almost like saying emperor. It has a lot of cultural resonance in that civilization. And Nobunaga, Hideyoshi hadn't even tried that because their rule was too unsteady. So this guy is very powerful and feels very secure in his control, especially over the daimyo. He demands their allegiance. Anyone who doesn't give him promises of lifetime allegiance are basically knocked out and replaced. He wants to avoid any kind of revolutionary movement against him. So he does one thing that a lot of governments have done in the past, including other governments in Japan and China and even some Europeans. He tries to disarm the population. He tries to force people to turn over their weapons. Because if people don't have weapons and if they want to start a revolution, what are they going to do? Go out and fight with shovels and rakes or something? What happens if they go up against a professional state military, a government-trained military that is very well supplied and very heavily armed? The theory is that any kind of peasant uprising that had destabilized Japan and China and a lot of other civilizations in the past just won't have much of a chance here. So he wants the government to be far better armed than his own peasants or people. He wouldn't really call them citizens yet. Does that sound familiar to you? Do governments still do this today? Yes. There's a lot of the debate today over the Second Amendment in the Constitution, which guarantees the people the right to bear arms, specifically for these kinds of reasons, if you ever read the Constitution. Some government leaders don't like that. Some of them fear it. Of course, a lot of people think the Second Amendment should be upheld because the people should be able to rise up against the U.S. government whenever they want. If you want to take your shotguns and go off against the U.S. Marines and their tanks and planes and bombs and even atomic weapons, good luck to you. But that's one of the big debates that's going on even in the U.S. today. What kind of revolution can you really bring against the government when the government is so much better armed than the people? So that's Tokugawa, and one of his big ideas to specifically control the daimyo, he realized that their ability to rise against him was based in the fact that they had big bank accounts. If he did something or the government did something to anger a lot of the landowners, they might take their extra money and just start buying up soldiers. And if they can buy enough soldiers, they can start a revolution. So Tokugawa take steps to attack their wealth. Not through taxation so much, but by forcing them to spend it. So Tokugawa created a system that, again, a lot of other governments, especially in China, had theorized even way back in ancient history. Tokugawa tended to stay in the capital city. He traveled around every once in a while, but his government was based in that city. And his government created a system where they forced the big landowners of all the regions to keep a house in the city. So that when Tokugawa calls the landowners to the capital for meetings or celebrations or something like that, then they have a place to stay. They don't just go, rent a hotel room or something like that. They have their own house. And Tokugawa, during these kinds of times when he would call the landowners to the capital city, he wouldn't invite them into the kind of imperial palace. He would go and visit them in their homes and hold meetings in their houses. Which means that, the house has to be fairly nice, right? If the emperor is going to visit your place, you don't want to have a dump, right? If the president of the United States sends you a letter one day saying, I want to hold a political event in your apartment, are you going to clean up the place? If you don't, his handlers probably will, because they don't like the image of him being in a place that is, racked with, poverty or disease or anything like that. So it becomes a tradition and a kind of legal demand of the government that the landowners spend huge amounts of money. They're not just going to have a little house. They're going to have mansions. They're going to have constant servants keeping the place clean just in case he calls all the landowners in and starts having meetings and in case he picks your place. It has to be very ornate. There has to be good food. There has to be a lot of space. So these places are hugely expensive to keep up. And he did it specifically to force them to spend money. Because the more money they spend, what does that equal? The less money they have saved. The less money they have saved means they can't really rise against him because they don't have the savings to buy up armies, to pay soldiers. Does that make sense? So this is an economic attack. And he knew it. And other European kings and other Japanese emperors' dynasties had done this exact same thing. So you see it over and over again in human history. It is a general theory of control, and it's completely based in economics. And these are some famous kind of images, types of paintings of the daimyo arriving in tradition and gathering in Edo and having the meetings. And this is a thing that the Tokugawa shogunate did not just want to do for symbolic reasons, but for real political control reasons. They're looking to stay in power. And they want to avoid revolution at any cost, as most governments usually do, even as we're obviously seeing right now. So questions about any of that? Yeah.
You know the book Shogun?
The book?
There was a book, Shogun. They did a TV series back in the 80s.
Oh, no.
Okay.
I was
wondered if
probably too young for that. I was born in 80, so I didn't know much of anything.
About this. But it talks about the Shogun, how he comes to power, and I wonder if it's the same based on the Shogun. This guy.
I don't know. I just don't know. Never seen it.
I'll forgive you.
Okay. In doing a lot of this stuff, the economic types of attacks against the daimyo, it really stops the revolutionary movement in its tracks if it ever was willing or capable of breaking out so much in the first place against Tokugawa. And when you have a strong central government and the lack of infighting amongst the landowners and a lack of an ability to rise against the central government, there just isn't much civil war. And usually in human history, when you don't have wars, you don't tend to need a whole lot of soldiers around, right? So this leads into the kind of next step of economic attack specifically against the samurai, because they were the traditional warrior class. They had been landowners attached to this warrior status. It really puts them out of work, puts them into unemployment. If there's no one really much out there fighting, then what do you need fighters for? So again, this is the next step in their kind of movement away from being, ready to fight all the time to being more just kind of people that are attached to the wealthy families. They still train, they still do all of their traditional types of things, but the demands for soldiers is falling because the government is very stable and very powerful. Eesh. What was that? People don't know how to open doors easily. Okay. So there's a lot of internal economic dynamics going on within Japan, and then the Westerners show up in the 1500s, basically. Largely the Portuguese at first, because they were the first ones around the southern tip of Africa, going toward India. They eventually make it to India, China, the Southeast Asian islands, and also eventually Japan. So the Portuguese are largely the first to start making contact, to start wanting to trade, bring European goods into Japan. Japanese didn't really like European goods very much. But they were willing to sell Japanese goods to these Europeans for basically gold and silver and valuable kinds of minerals like that. So in certain aspects, much of the Japanese economy is also turning toward mercantilism as they're making contact with outside civilizations. So nothing very extraordinary or new about that. You tend to get that stuff going on when these civilizations start making consistent contact with each other. And that's a story also that goes way back into ancient history. The Tokugawa leadership, when the Europeans first start showing up, at first don't want the Europeans to enter Japan very much at all. For many of the same reasons that the Chinese government didn't want the Europeans in. Viewed them as kind of backward, dirty, barbarian types of guys, have different religious ideas, seemed absolutely intent on making as much money as they can without much regard for what that would do in destabilizing Japanese society or the Tokugawan government. So at first they are led into certain parts of Japan, watched very closely because they don't trust the Europeans. But very quickly the Tokugawan policy becomes isolation. Keep the Europeans out as much as possible. Use them for what they are useful for, mostly for bringing in wealth and some military ideas like gunpowder and whatnot. But keep them at an arm's distance, just like the Chinese did. At this exact same time in the 1500s, going into the 1600s, you have also large Japanese population growth. But they do not suffer the large kind of food shortages that you'll start seeing become epidemic in China. Japan never has the size population that China does at the same time as China. I mean, Japan is a much smaller place, much less farmland, and Japan is very largely mountainous also. And it's often difficult to grow crops on mountains because mountains are usually filled with rocks, in case you haven't noticed. But when the Europeans start showing up, they start introducing different types of crops to Japan that grow faster sometimes, so you get more crop yield, you get a larger harvest. So you start getting, even as the population grows, the food supply is also growing. So they don't have these real giant epidemic famines that you'll see in China from time to time that often destabilize Chinese governments. So populations are growing, and as populations often do, the cities grow first. The people that were not needed out in the countryside as farmers, who couldn't find work on farms, went to the big cities to find jobs. And obviously something that still happens today. That's a kind of human phenomenon. They go where the wealth is, and the cities are usually where the biggest wealth is, where the most businesses are, where the most buying and selling of goods is happening. So people flood into the cities. And a lot of these, what you might call early kind of towns built around forts or small cities, start growing very dramatically by the 1700s. There's a couple of Japanese cities, like Edo, that get eventually over 1 million inhabitants, which is a giant city compared to even the largest in Europe in the 1700s. And there are several Japanese cities that get up somewhere around 400,000 to 500,000, so about 500,000. So the Japanese cities are growing just as large if not larger than a lot of the European cities at the same point in history. And they're growing as a result of merchants moving goods back and forth, and they're also starting to travel from city to city. So Japan is, like China in a lot of ways, integrating their economy together. They're not so much isolated regions with different economies. They're becoming networks of trade. But like most ancient societies before the Industrial Revolution hits, first in Europe in the 1800s, this is overwhelmingly an agrarian society. The vast majority of workers in Japan are farmers, just like everywhere else in the world at the same point. Somewhere around 95% or so of all people in the world going into the late 1700s are farmers. They're growing food to feed society. And, of course, to sell the food and make money for themselves, if they can. So the kind of countryside, rural, agricultural life becomes a dominant part also of Japanese culture, just like it is in China, just like it is in Europe. Native American populations. It's a kind of endemic part of human society up until the Industrial Revolution, which shows you how much the Industrial Revolution has changed the world, right? Or at least changed our human experience in it. How many of you are farmers? Virtually none of you. Almost all of us work in buildings or factories or offices or something like that now. So our working lifestyles have largely, completely changed. Or what?
I have a small garden in my backyard.
Yeah, we farm for fun. Right? Not for survival. Well, we'll see what happens when the lights go out for a few weeks. You guys ever see a movie called A Trigger Effect? When the lights go out in the city like Los Angeles, giant city, and they don't come back on for weeks and weeks and weeks. You should watch that. It's an interesting thing. I'll give you one hint. Guns get very popular. Very quickly. Okay. So much like China, at the same point, and China even much earlier by the 1100s, the Japanese cities and the Japanese economy seems to have the kind of raw necessities that even Britain has in the 1700s that will push Britain into the Industrial Revolution. Japan has a lot of those same things happening in its civilization. It has large cities, has trade networks that are linking the cities together, has transportation and communication systems, has a large unemployed class that if factories were built, they could flood into the factories and be the kind of low-wage workers that Britain and Europe will experience in the 1800s. So a lot of historians ask, why doesn't Japan start going into the Industrial Revolution? And many historians answer this, and it's still fairly controversial. The Tokugawa government policy was neutral regarding this kind of growth of capitalism, or growth of what we today call industrial capitalism, the building of machines and factories. The government does not subsidize it, does not support it, does not give tax breaks for those that would build those kinds of things, but doesn't stop them from doing it either. So the government basically has very little stance on it. Whereas the British government gives very heavy subsidies to create monopolies and big businesses that will build the factories, and gives huge tax breaks to entrepreneurs, that scientific inventors, and people who will build the machines and eventually locate them in factories and build the Industrial Revolution in Britain and then spread it to Europe. But at the same time, there's also a merchant class in Japan that is rising to wealth through this trade network that is growing. So much like in Europe at the same point, you're also getting the merchants rising to wealth, and with wealth they start getting access to political power, the way most wealthy groups do throughout human society. Once you get rich, your number one goal often is to keep your wealth. And to do that, you often try to get some kind of say in government to, get favorable tax rates or subsidies or something to protect your wealth, to insulate your wealth from being depleted by government policy. it's we can go through the statistics of what the U.S. is today with a wealthy dominating politics, but I think it's pretty clear, right? No? No. We'll talk about that later. And you guys watch the Bill Clinton speech yesterday? When you have Bill Clinton talking about the value of compromise and doing great things for the economy, a lot of people forget about a lot of stuff that Clinton did with those compromises and building the world financial crash in 2008. He had a very heavy hand in that stuff. But it's another view of history that especially Clinton never wants to admit to, or his supporters. So you start getting the rise of what historians call kind of proto-industry, kind of like an early step toward industrialization, but it's slow, it's not coordinated. And in the end, it does not push Japan into any kind of form of industrial revolution. So Japan will basically have to play catch-up to Europe in industrialization in the late 1800s. They will fall behind very dramatically and very quickly. Basically, much of Japan by the mid-1800s will be living in the kind of European world of the mid-1700s. And when you fall that far behind countries like Britain, France, Germany, the United States, they get attacked. And they learn from those attacks. They learn the necessity of industrialization. But they are taking very slow, uncoordinated steps toward economic integration of their regions. They develop kind of national banking systems. You start getting even early forms of what we would today think of as like savings and checking accounts, which is important for moving money around and making investment. And of course, kind of road and distribution networks, communication networks. So, questions about the rise of possible industrialization in Japan. And it's a hugely important topic. Industrialization changed the world. When we walk into this class in the year 1500, Europeans are one of the weakest civilizations in the world. And that flips completely when they go into industrialization. Think about this. The Europeans conquer some places in the New World and whatnot, but they have very difficult time keeping control, right? Until they do industrialization. And by the late 1800s, between 1800 and 1900, as Europe industrializes, they conquer all of Africa, nearly all of China, all of India, almost all of Southeast Asia, and they largely control Central and South America. All within 100 years of starting industrialization. We'll get to the exact reasons of that, but basically they start building machine guns and bombs. And when your army has machine guns and the native army has swords and spears and bows and arrows, guess who wins the war? Easily. So this question of industrialization changes the source of world power, right? And who runs the world today? Who's the most powerful countries in the world? They're mostly the United States and Europe, the most advanced industrialized societies and militaries. So if China had done this first in the 1100s, 700 years before Britain even gets started, China could have been the first through the door, and China could today be by far the dominant power on the globe. Or if Japan had done it first, they could have achieved world power much quicker and could have possibly invaded Europe. I mean, that's the long-term result of industrialization. So whoever undergoes that first will have a huge advantage over all other world civilizations. And the Europeans will eventually use it. And again, the samurai are largely attacked economically because the new kind of economic system, number one, the samurai were traditionally, culturally barred from trade. They were supposed to be training to fight. They were supposed to be the expert kind of lifetime warriors. They were not supposed to run their own businesses. They weren't supposed to dedicate their lives to making money. So when they have their fiefdoms, their lands taken away and become basically the attachment to wealthy families rather than the landowning families themselves, and then you get, again, the mass kind of unemployment because there's so few wars to fight, they start getting very desperate economically. To the point where they start attaching themselves to daimyo families that use them in fairly underhanded ways sometimes. And every once in a while the daimyo will attack each other and try to get each other's land. And this is where you start seeing a kind of reemergence of the idea of samurai loyalty. Because there's a problem with it. If a whole lot of samurai are wandering around Japan looking for a kind of landlord to work for, to be employed by, the idea of being loyal to the one that you've signed the contract with becomes a very important thing. Because if you break that contract and just go to the next highest bidder, what guarantee does that highest bidder have that you're going to be loyal to him? Virtually none. Just the fact that you can pay the most. So the idea of loyalty very much reemerges within the samurai class. And you start getting a lot of stories that are based in samurai loyalty that become myths and legends and eventually today movies and books and whatnot. The most famous was the story of the 47 samurai, which is basically there were these 47 samurai who worked for their one lord, their one daimyo, and kind of one of the neighboring groups assassinated that lord, right? And so the samurai, these 47 guys, make it their life mission to seek vengeance, to take out that other lord as retribution, right? As revenge. According to the myth, they actually do accomplish it. They get into the guy's house, they kill him. And what do they do after that? They commit suicide. Because this is seen as their life's mission. It's accomplished. They have no point in living anymore. So it's seen as the great loyalty to the one that they had basically promised themselves to. So this becomes a kind of symbolic myth, legends, emphasizing the idea of loyalty amongst this fighting class. And again, this also feeds into the kind of economic system that the Tokugawa are building up. If the Tokugawa are raising the cost of living for the daimyo, they're basically kind of, with today's equivalent, would be like the government raising taxes on corporations. What do corporations often do when their taxes are raised? How do they pay it? Do they pay it themselves? No, they just raise the prices of the goods they're selling and pass the payment off to you. And the daimyo did very much the same thing. When they start getting attacked economically by the government, who raises their standard of living by having to have all these mansions in the capital and whatnot, the daimyo will pay for this by raising taxes on their own peasants in their own regions. Therefore, they slide the payment downward and have the lower class pay for the increased living standard. And a lot of peasants are forced into bankruptcy and servitude, and sometimes imprisonment when their taxes go up. This is the kind of poor class of people who are barely, treading water economically the way things are, and once the taxes go up, they drown. That's it for them. They can't keep up. So a lot of these sometimes smaller landowners become wage workers themselves. So you're getting what eventually critics of capitalism will call the accumulation of capital, the accumulation of wealth in fewer and fewer and fewer hands. As the daimyo go to economic warfare against each other, and specifically, when they raise the price or raise the taxes on their peasants, that forces the peasants under. So those that survive this become enriched, but most do not survive it. And when you start getting the rise of unemployment, desperation, destitution, the peasants themselves become a possible revolutionary class against the government, because they realize that they're the ones getting screwed in the end of this deal. And Tokugawa Japan has frequent, especially in the 1800s, has frequent attempts at peasant uprisings, because the peasants are desperate. They want food. And a lot of times, these peasant uprisings join with the samurai, who themselves feel victimized over the long term. And whenever you have a large unemployed class of experienced soldiers, that becomes a dangerous thing in society, especially for the sitting government. Because those are guys who are used to violence. They're not worried about killing to get what they want. And they've done it before. That's a class of people that you don't want to make angry, right? Which is something that the U.S. government should probably learn very quickly. Okay, so questions about the economics? Very much at all. Perfect clarity. Okay. Okay, going back to Western intrusion, which is again a kind of cyclical type of system that started off our conversation on Japanese economics, kind of intervened, and then we went back to what the government's doing again. Again, the Portuguese are the first to break in about the mid-1500s. And at first they're welcomed by the shogunate, as the shogunate starts to emerge in the 1600s. Because the Europeans brought some things that the Japanese government was interested in, especially military technology and increased amounts of gold and silver and whatnot. But the Europeans had some gunpowder, even low-level kind of cannon by then, and muskets and whatnot. So the Japanese were eager to learn how to make that stuff and how to use it. And once they found out those secrets, they start trying to keep the Europeans at quite a distance. Once you learn their secrets, you try to get rid of them. So the Tokugawa government's eventual foreign policy with the Europeans is much like the Chinese. Keep them far south, and especially keep them down in the southern islands away from the mainland Japanese population. You want to have ports where you allow them to come in every once in a while and start to trade so you can get the stuff from Europe that you want. But you don't want them mixing with the Japanese people, because the government believes Japanese culture is superior, and if the European idea is spread through Japan, that may incite peasant uprisings. And the Europeans are known to want to take down domestic governments in other parts of the world, especially governments that resist. And especially the British will do this again and again and again throughout the world during their imperialistic era. European traders are not the only people moving into Japan. Just like with China, you get European missionaries who suddenly kind of discover that Japan has a large population of non-Christians, and of course these European Christians think, oh, this is a horrible thing, we have to go save their souls and help them, so they view helping them as spreading Christianity in Japan as much as possible. That is very offensive to the Tokugawa government. At first they don't mind so much, as long as the kind of Japanese converts to Christianity still give their loyalty to the Japanese government, to the Tokugawa government. That runs into many problems. One is that eventually the Pope at the time will demand that Japanese Christians give higher loyalty to the European Pope than they do to the Tokugawa government. So the government's not going to like that very much. European Christians, like Europeans in general, tended to try to break into Japanese politics and push the Japanese government around. So when the Japanese government starts to resist, they will also start to resist the spread of Christianity in Japan, and eventually repress Japanese Christians. And of course, much like with the Reformation in Europe, a lot of Christians go into religious buildings and shrines, and they see all this imagery that Protestant groups tend to not like very much. And so just like the Reformation, when they went in with iconoclasm and supposedly cleansed these religious buildings by removing or breaking the idols, they do much the same thing in Japan to cultural icons that had been in existence for generations, and sometimes destroy them and try to cleanse these Japanese religious areas and bring Christianity to them, which is hugely offensive to Japanese culture, the Japanese people, and especially the government. So even Tokugawa himself, the first Tokugawa, starts taking steps to teach Christians coming into Japan a lesson that they can't get away with this stuff. This is going too far. And a lot of this even goes back to the 1500s of Hideyoshi. At first, when this starts to get out of hand, the relations with Christians in Japan start getting out of hand, they issue a government decree that stops the spread of Christianity, and at some point even makes it illegal. But this is still the point where the Japanese government wants to trade with the Europeans because the Europeans are bringing in valuable things. So the government kind of officially announces the end of the spread of Christianity in Japan, and then just kind of ignores its own role and just kind of allows it to go on under the rug for a while. And eventually the decree is somewhat changed to Christianity can spread in Japan as long as it's quiet, it's not offensive, it's not going to break things, it's not going to try to start any uprisings or anything like that. So there is kind of the reemergence of toleration of Christianity and permission for Japanese people to convert to Christianity if they so choose. So Christianity is growing and growing in Japan, and so is European influence. Until there is a peasant uprising of Japanese Christians in 1637, which outrages the government because the last thing governments want are revolutions against it. So starting in 37, there is a movement of the Japanese government to make Christianity illegal. Japanese people caught practicing Christian rituals are jailed and often executed. You could be executed for having a Christian friend. So this is very heavy-handed stuff. This is the government coming down harshly, as governments often do when an uprising fails. And we're obviously seeing that throughout the world also today, right? And this forced a lot of Japanese Christians into hiding. They have secret rituals where they like do it in the middle of the night in their house or something. They do not do this publicly because it's hugely against the law, and they know that they will be punished. Remember, this is a dictatorship, as most governments were back then. And from really the early 1600s going forward, again, the only trade allowed is way in these southern islands, and specifically in the city of Nagasaki. And this policy of Japanese isolation from the outside world becomes known as sakoku. That's this word in quotes down at the bottom. That is the official government policy of only let the Europeans, and eventually they restricted mostly to only being Dutch people coming in, Dutch traders. They will only let them into one harbor for only about 2 months a year. They're not allowed to travel outside that city. They're given kind of apartments in that city, and they are watched constantly by government spies. All their cargoes are heavily inspected. So this is very, very close control over the European trade. And that's the official Japanese policy that will go forward for a long, long time. All right, so questions about the Western intrusion at all? Perfect clarity still. You guys are alive?
Yeah.
Glad to hear you're alive. All right, some cultural differences. Japan, much like China, built up this massive kind of traditional civilization, this traditional culture, where traditions become almost worshipped in themselves. And social norms become almost unbreakable in a lot of ways, where you'd be socially ostracized for breaking any of these kind of social mores. One of the major changes, though, that takes a long time, it's a kind of long shifting trend over several generations, is within kind of philosophical ideas, philosophical movements. Ideology, basically. You start getting a very slow but general movement away from a kind of mystical, afterlife type of obsessed Buddhism toward a more kind of real world type of Confucianism, where they're more interested in day-to-day human interactions than they are with, say, purifying their spirit for the rebirth or anything like that. So this is a very long-term thing. It's hard to just pick out one single year or even 1 or 2 decades where this starts to quicken very much. It's a very slow-moving process that by the mid to late 1800s is fairly powerful. So this is happening over a few hundred years, eventually to the point where Japanese culture has moved more toward a kind of real-world philosophy than especially China, that is still largely Buddhist. And a lot of historians argue that this is one of the major keys that by the late 1800s will convince the Japanese government, the head policymakers, to make the transition to adopt Western technologies, Western philosophy, scientific developments, and military strategies. Basically, Japan will start to industrialize in the late 1800s to catch up to Europe because they feel threatened by Europe, and the culture now seems kind of open to the idea of bringing in outside ideas as long as they're useful for day-to-day life. And of course, national defense. Whereas in China, where the government is completely resistant to that stuff for much, much longer, and it appears that the culture is not as open to bringing in outside ideas. The Chinese will fall far, far behind, to the point where even in the early 1900s, Japan will invade parts of China and take colonies in China itself. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Japan makes the transition into a more westernized state, a more industrialized state. And China does not. And you will see when we get to the late 1800s a stark difference in the realities of kind of worldly power between Japan and China. So does that make sense? And it's a big kind of theoretical shift, but it's important to understand for the long term. Okay, another major kind of fundamentally important aspect of Japanese society is the family. Largely because these are agricultural-based societies. These are people that grow up with their family, they farm together. So what we would think of as the nuclear family becomes hugely important to their culture. The parents, the children, siblings. That is a fundamental aspect. And that is their term for a kind of central family. And of course, it's also a very patriarchal society, which means men dominated the society. They dominated the family, they dominated the marriage, the older brothers dominated the younger brothers, the brothers told the sisters what to do. I mean, in almost all aspects, men dominate the society in any kind of relations they have with women. So women have, particularly in samurai communities, a samurai society, women are heavily oppressed. They have no powers to choose who they marry. A lot of Japanese families, especially samurai families, do not want to have daughters because they're expensive to raise, because daughters can't do the kind of physical work often and are viewed as kind of too delicate to do real hard labor. So they are expensive because they are a constant mouth to feed and they're not doing much work. So a lot of Japanese families, when they have a daughter, will sometimes allow that baby to die, much like even a lot of European societies in ancient circumstances. They often, if the family is going broke, they will sell their daughter into a kind of slavery or prostitution to a wealthy family. Or they'll just try to get that daughter married off to someone else as fast as possible and have someone else pay for her. So you also get the rise of large dowries in Japan, which is also pretty common in Europe at the same point. Have we talked about that in here? What a dowry is? A dowry is a more European term for when a wedding happens, the father of the bride pays the groom to take her away. Because now the husband is going to take care of her, right? He's going to be responsible for feeding her and all that stuff. So the father views this as a great thing because you're taking that mouth to feed away. You're taking the economic cost away. So oftentimes the father paid the husband, the new husband, the groom, to take the kid out of here. Is that still an important kind of phenomenon in Western culture, or at least American culture? Yes, it seeps right down to today. Traditionally, who pays for the wedding? The wife's parents. So we see the still kind of seeping down end results of this is still going on in a lot of our society because it's tradition. It's unquestioned. Today it doesn't make so much sense. Women only get paid 75% of what men do in the same jobs. We know that, but not nearly the differences in pay scale that used to exist. So that's one of the problems of tradition. They become so culturally ingrained that they often just never get questioned, right? So we still have a lot of these types of problems in different ways. Women, especially in Japanese culture and especially in samurai culture, are almost never educated. Some very rich families do allow their daughters to be educated because they have the extra money and they see it as like a rare and kind of cool thing to do. Shows off how much money they have. I have so much money I can actually have a daughter, hire a tutor to teach her to read and write. How cool is that? Just like the Europeans will eventually start teaching their daughters not to do real high-level education stuff like high-level mathematics or science or anything like that. They mostly learn to play the piano and write a journal and cute, pretty little things like that. Nothing hugely important, right? But that's how a lot of people show off their wealth. Okay, there's also a very rigid social hierarchy in Japan. And it was organized in this way where the warriors were usually the most respected. Those are the samurai. That's the traditional kind of highest level. We've seen them falling economically. So you're getting the systematic collapse of the samurai as an economic power. But they are still traditionally viewed as a kind of economic higher-ups. But at the same time, the artisans and the merchants are rising. So even in the economic reality, as the merchants are getting more power and the samurai are falling, according to the rigid kind of social stratification system, the status system, it is still a kind of much higher status to be one of the samurai than one of the merchants. So that causes all kinds of kind of psychological internal problems, social problems. And of course, the peasant kind of farmers are pretty much at the bottom of the mass accepted scale, but they have an underclass. Yep.
What do they do?
They are the garbage cleaners, the street sweepers, and basically the crap cleaners of society. They are viewed as the lowest of the low, not much higher than animals. And these traditions, these cultural distinctions basically make it so that it is very, very, very rare for a peasant to marry into a merchant family. You just don't get much combinations. If you're born into a certain class, you're probably going to marry a person from that same class. Overwhelmingly likely. And it's extraordinarily rare for these classes to intermix. And the Ida are just always pushed aside. In the 1600s, you also start getting the growth of literacy. And this is where Japan starts eventually catching up to European literacy rates. Because again, the merchants have the money to educate their children, and reading becomes a cool thing. So when the rich start learning to read and start viewing that as valuable and necessary, a lot of the lower classes want to learn to read, if only for a status thing than anything else. So you also get the growth of Japanese printing presses at the same time, so books become much cheaper to print, therefore they're much cheaper to buy. You get mass production of books. You know, in the medieval period in Europe, at least, books were literally worth their weight in gold. Literally. Because it took that much to pay someone to hand copy, page by page, a book. That took a lot of time. When you get the printing press, you just line up a page onto a block and just put some ink on it. Boom, you got your page. That's all it took. So books are mass produced in Europe and also started in Japan in the 1600s. So therefore, they're cheaper to buy. That means that people of lower economic status can afford to buy a kind of newspaper, a pamphlet, or something like that and learn to read that way. You also get a lot of traditional art that continues to grow. The most traditional is called kabuki. It is hugely stylized. There's a lot of makeup and costumes and kind of set pieces involved in this. This is like the highest level production. These are like the Batman movies of back then, where they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on all the great special effects and stuff, and people are just floored by what they're seeing. You know, these are the most expensive, the most traditional, and the most honorable productions to be involved in. A lot of their stories focused on what we would think of as the underworld, kind of gangland murder and greed, backstabbing, what they called the floating world. So there's a lot of emotional stories that are involved in this, a lot of ideas of personal loyalty. So we see a lot of different kind of economic pieces that are being represented in the art. And right down to this day, it's still very stylized. And you can go into Los Angeles and go to kabuki theaters and see this for yourself. If you are raised in kind of Western or Americanized culture, it's a very different experience to go see one of these things in person. But a lot of these stories emphasize bribery, backstabbing, deception, murder.
So reality?
No. Reality for the people who want power. So this is the kind of secret world that's out of the public eye, the kind of black market kind of stuff. And it's the same kind of stuff we make movies about today, right? Because it's exciting. It's fun to watch gangster movies because they're always killing each other. There's always something going on. Right? You guys seen The Departed? It's a great movie because it's all about deception. How are these people going to figure out who's actually doing this stuff? Or The Godfather or something like that. Okay, we'll stop there. So any questions about art or culture or how things are changing or traditions are continuing?
Were they mostly men? All men that?
Yes. No. All right, so we'll take a break, come back at 35 after, and we'll start the test.